Well, welcome everyone to day 2 of the Ravenspurgh Goth Festival 2026. Thank you for everyone who joined in last night, and we've got a good evening of entertainment for you and engagement with you today. For those of you who don't know, or those who just joined in, effectively, this is the most cutting-edge exclusive Goth Festival in the UK, because not only is it a place you may not have heard of necessarily, it's also in a place that doesn't exist anymore, because it's under the ocean and has been for a few hundred years now. And that is the reason why we think this is a unique frontier of Goth events, and especially it's on the East Coast as well, which, as everyone knows, all the best of it. Festivals are run on the East Coast of Yorkshire. It's just science. Now, speaking of science, here comes the science bit, as they said in the famous advert, or rather the social science bit, is what we say. Well, we're delighted to welcome Emily Robinson from the University of Sussex and Kathryn Maude from the National Archive to talk about their work and about uncovering the history of a place called Ravenser Odd and its relation to our very own Ravenspurgh, which we're here to celebrate and commiserate and build upon, as it were, without getting our feet wet, of course. So just to start us off then, what was Ravenser Odd?
So Ravenser Odd was a medieval town. It wasn't there for very long. It's pretty short-lived. We think probably about 130 years, although it's not very clear. And it was around about where Ravenspurgh was as well, a little bit later. Ravenser Odd was earlier. So it was sort of probably just off the coast of Spurn Point, although we're not really sure exactly where. And it was a sort of new town that grew up and became pretty wealthy, quite kind of belligerent, and then was washed away really over a matter of decades, but relatively suddenly in terms of people's livelihoods, and there's not much trace of it left.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
It's a very, I think it's a very kind of fun thing for us to think about today, because if you go to Spurn Point, Joel, maybe you've been, and you look out to sea, you can't imagine that there were hundreds of people living there, but it was actually a really kind of bustling, lively settlement. It had these trade links with Europe, with Scandinavia, and it was also it sent MPs to Parliament. It had a stone church, it had windmills, it had a tannery. It was a really kind of vibrant, bustling settlement. It starts out kind of from a sandbank in the 1230s, gets to these kind of dizzying heights over about 50, 60 years, and then really kind of declines over the next 60, 70 years, and then disappears again under the sea. And sadly, we don't exactly know where it is, or at least Emily and I don't like to speculate too much about where exactly it was, as we're historians and not, geographers.
Yeah. I mean, it's quite intriguing for it to be a new town, but it only to lasted 130 years as well. That's like so Milton Keynes, for example, is not that old, is it? Of course, and it probably won't suffer the same fate as Ravenser Odd did. Well, then, at this rate, we never know. Of course, I think that's fair to say. And it's intriguing use of belligerent. Is it a belligerent town? Is this a euphemism for goings on?
Well, it was always getting into trouble with its neighbours. I mean, we have a lot of the records that we have from it are letters kind of complaining about its conduct, or court cases complaining about some of the things that its people were getting up to. So they were doing things like one of the places that was really particularly annoyed was Grimsby, so just on the other side of the Humber. People who don't know the area that well, so not very far, sort of if you're traveling by boat, but the way that the geography works is, there's like the estuary and it comes in, and Ravenser Odd was like right at the mouth of the estuary. So all the trade that would have gone to Grimsby was suddenly being kind of waylaid. There were reports of people rowing out in little boats and kind of persuading the ships, either that they would get better prices or kind of threatening and forcing them to come and dock at Ravenser Odd as well. So there's a lot of stuff like that going on. So yeah, the kind of belligerence, I think, comes from that, and it's definitely part of its reputation. But just something else you said about the kind of the new townness of it. I think one of the things we've been trying to think about is how much the kind of precariousness of the location. So being right out on the edge there, it's obviously a kind of dangerous place to be. It's how it gets washed away by the water coming from both the Humber and from the North Sea. It's a windy place, but also whether that was part of the attraction. So it's this economic advantage. It gives them the kind of the links to the trade, but it also, one of the things that Kath's been finding in the records of the National Archives is it gives it kind of wind power. It has, quite a lot of a sort of extraordinary amount of windmills, I think, for its size. So it's a place now that still has these wind farms, or again has these wind farms. So we're really thinking about like what's the connection between the dangers and the opportunities.
Oh, that's fantastic. I mean, it's almost like a Wild East operation, like enterprising bandits setting up their own town, and it's all about a basic hustle, isn't it? Really, in a way.
And they kind of become legitimate, right? As these things often do. So as they kind of push out to this place, we have this kind of possibly apocryphal story told in one of the early records that what happened was fishermen used to dry their nets on this sandbank, and then over time a kind of ship was wrecked there, and then someone started living in the ship, and that was the kind of beginning of the town.
Right.
And that's kind of how people narrate it kind of 50-60 years later. They're kind of narrating, oh, that's how this town came about, and they talk about it as being nata fuit in Latin, like it was born from the sea. So there's these kind of very poetic moments in the kind of legal text, and they say it's the distance of one tide from Grimsby. So if anyone has any idea how far that is, write in, because it might help us work out where it is. But yeah, so they have a kind of sense of like it's this kind of interesting place where things that might not be possible elsewhere become possible, but only for quite a short period of time. But in that time, they become very legitimate. They get their royal charter, they start sending MPs to Parliament, they build their fancy church, they kind of become upstanding townspeople. Before then, the town starts very literally washing away, and then they have to kind of scatter.
Well, I mean, I'm imagining some kind of like some Peaky Blinders rise and fall of Ravenser Odd kind of story here. Interesting that the thing about the ship, it's almost like a weird settler narrative, isn't it, in a way? But obviously in a place that doesn't have to be settled. It's like a kind of like a vanguardy kind of it's mythology of a place. The very surprising in its context.
There are people who we know have property in both Hull and Ravenser Odd, so it's not very clear whether they live in Hull and they just kind of go to Ravenser Odd when they need to, or maybe they let out the property on Ravenser Odd. So it's not very clear whether how settled the kind of richer folks are there, or whether they're just kind of visiting.
So what's the connection to Ravenspurgh? I think we in the course of the festival, we kind of know Ravenspurgh has a similar story of a seemingly important seaport that was the site of a few landings by English kings or English wannabes during that period, was mentioned in Shakespeare and Helen Pease, etc. But obviously it seems to be, did these two places overlap at all in time, or were they two separate areas?
So it's quite hard to work out what the kind of connection is. From what we know, it seems as though Ravenspurgh is the kind of successor. So Ravenser Odd is washed away in like the 1350s. And then it's really kind of the 1390s when we start to get mentions of Ravenspurgh, but it seems to be pretty much in the same location, we think. But we don't have at the moment, although we're finding stuff all the time, we don't really have anything that sort of discusses the connection between the two in contemporary sources. There's nothing sort of saying, we're going to build this town back up again, or even whether it is a town. Actually, by the time we're talking about Ravenspurgh, there's kind of hermits there. It's a kind of landing site, but I'm not sure whether it's a town in quite the same way. I think a lot of the stories that we have about it kind of confuse the two, and actually is the Ravenser Odd part of the history, I think. yeah, Kath, would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, so it is, as you say, this kind of very important landing point for these English kings kind of coming in. But from the sources that we have from the time, it's not super clear whether there's like a harbour for them to land in, or whether in fact they're landing there because it's a slightly under the radar place to land, right? Like if you come into Hull, everyone knows you've arrived. But actually, if you come in at Ravenspur, maybe it would be like landing on Spurn Point today. You know, maybe there'd be a load of geese to see you, but there might not be loads of people. A load of geese at a hermit. There's not still a Spurn Point. Emily and I did consider trying to apply for some money to become the Spurn Point hermits as part of our research. You know, embodied research is all the rage now. We're going to go and live on the end of the on the end of Spurn Point and just like think about what it would be like to be a hermit. But so far, no one's bitten. So if anyone knows any kind of open-minded sources of research funding, they can hook us up. So I think that is a really kind of interesting moment where this big town has kind of gone. But obviously, there's local memory from the similarities in the name, right? And we look for kind of Ravenser Odd, Ravenspur, and then it becomes Spurn Point. So there is a kind of continuity there. Right. We've lost the Raven, right? But there's a kind of continuity over time of these place names, even though each of them kind of keeps getting lost. You know, the East Coast even today is a landscape of loss in lots of ways, right? There's always kind of bits of it washing away.
Yeah. And one thing we haven't talked about actually is the prehistory. So there's already a place called Ravenser there. It's not particularly large. And it's not mentioned in Doomsday Book or anything like that, but it is mentioned in some sort of Scandinavian kind of poems and kind of epics, although they are written a bit later. They're written around the time that Ravenser Odd is also there, but they sort of talk about how when the Norwegian army is coming in for the Battle of Stamford Bridge, that they go past Ravenser. So it's already this kind of place that's sort of on the periphery of these kind of big national stories about, you know, battles and kings and the fate of England, really.
So in a way, that Spurn Point and Ravenser both, well, Ravenser especially was like was a place already there, and after Ravenser Odd is like a enterprising base off that. And Ravenspur being probably a little bit later, slightly further inland, we think, possibly.
Yeah, it could be, but it could still be out there again. You know, like if the sandbank has sort of come back up again, you know, it's not very clear what actually.
You can tell we're not geographers. We're like, maybe the sandbank has returned. But you know, they make a lot of the shifting sands in the medieval sources. They're like, you know, this is treacherous. And even now, right, you need a kind of Humber pilot to take you to Hull. Like the sandbanks are moving all the time. So I do think there is a kind of sense of this landscape as not fixed and not stable. That is true then, but continues to be true now.
Yeah.
And with that point as well, like the end of it could well become an island again. It looked like it was going to a few years ago, and then maybe that's changing. But yeah, that it's this very kind of shifting, precarious kind of landscape.
Yeah. So I mean, one would say probably the very worst place to build a port in that sense. If it were going to be like what we call a officially sanctioned legal port, it'd be very difficult to run something there. But if you're going to run a place to dump your ship and run inland and trade nefariously, would be quite a useful place to be. No customs officers and so forth from where else, and you know, no inspectors to see what you're carrying and everything else.
Yeah, apart from that, we do have loads of like customs reports and stuff, so they do have that going on. But well, I guess one of the things that's interesting is that early on, people are complaining about it and saying that it's not paying the right taxes, it's not doing the right things, it's not going through the processes, and it's behaving as if it's a borough that doesn't have to do these things when it isn't. But then it quickly gets made a borough, it gets made like a royal borough, and then it has all these privileges. So yeah, what Kath said before about it sort of starting kind of illegitimately and then sort of forcing its way into legitimacy, you can kind of see that happening there.
Yes, so like going in through the back door, if you like.
Ask for forgiveness, not permission, I guess.
Yes, I mean, we know a lot about that in Goth City, to be honest. So in terms of a,
Kath's been doing some amazing stuff with the customs report. She's been like looking through all of like all the stuff that's coming, all these kind of different goods and products and stuff that are coming from all over the place. I don't know about that, Kath.
Yeah, we have a lot of so we have this long series of customs accounts, which because they're the accounts of alien merchants, so kind of foreign merchants, not English-owned ships, they have to list all of the goods that they're bringing in. And because they're coming from Scandinavia, they're bringing in mostly kind of wood, which is very much still a kind of Scandinavian import to the UK today, but also they're bringing in things like reindeer hides and huge numbers of squirrels. Like, I guess you would need a lot of squirrels to make anything out of, but they used to use them to trim the kind of your coats and then round the bottom of the coat. So you would use squirrel fur for that, kind of grey squirrel fur from the Baltic. The squirrels are bigger there, the trees are bigger, everything's bigger. But also things like that I've spent quite a long time working with these and kind of thinking about them. And I had to look up a lot of words. And one of them was this kind of blue lichen that's taken from trees that's used to dye cloth. So they're bringing in a lot of that to kind of dye cloth blue. It's a kind of alternative to lapis lazuli, which is very, very expensive, kind of that also comes in from the East, but kind of different bit of the East. But then my favorite one is that there's a number of felt hats. So they're kind of bringing in from Scandinavia and from the Netherlands, the kind of latest in continental fashion, which is this series of probably Swedish felt hats. So I think we can imagine the Moomins. I imagined the Moomins when I found them with their little pointy felt hats. And so it is this kind of very vibrant trading port. There would have been a lot of languages there. We know that there are people from Norway, people from the Netherlands, people coming up from Calais. We have evidence of people kind of coming across from what is now Germany. So there would have been a big mix of languages. Some of those people stayed. We have evidence from kind of other records that people stayed. So it is this kind of, just like a port city today, right? A city that has people from all over that are kind of coming in to trade, and then perhaps they meet someone, or they decide that it's better in, obviously, on the east coast of England, one of the best places to be. It's better there than, the forests of Scandinavia or whatever. And so they decide to stay. And so we have this really, I think, interesting sense of it as being on the edge in some ways, but actually also, because so much more travel is by sea, being kind of central in that sense, right? If you think about the kind of relationship between Scandinavia and Calais, Ravensworth's kind of in the middle there, right? So it becomes kind of central in some ways, even though we now think of it as like the end of the world.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's fascinating that these are kind of like designer goods that they're bringing in a lot of time. It's like the exotic things from across the continent that they wouldn't be able to get. I wouldn't necessarily be trafficked through Grimsby, for example, I would imagine. I mean, so in terms of when it became a royal borough, when do we think that took place, and what did that mean to the town when it was given that status?
Yeah, do you want to go, Kath?
Yeah, so this happens right at the end of the 13th century, so 1299, and it happens on the same day as Hull gets its royal borough status. So the king is in the north, and he's like, we'll do both of these at once. And because Hull is still there, Hull still has its royal charter, and they're very proud of it. It's a beautiful document. It's at the Hull History Centre. It's got Edward I's big seal, with him on one hand crowned and on the other side on horseback. And Ravenser Odd would have had one of those too, but as it's under the sea, we don't have it anymore. But luckily, the National Archives, we still have, I guess I like to think about it as the kind of email outbox of the court, because what they were doing at this point, which is quite unusual across Europe, is they're copying out all of the charters that they issue. And so we have this series called the Charter Rolls, which is a copy of all of the charters that the king issues. So if you lose your charter, you can come back and you can say, oh, I've misplaced it. But you know, the king, someone wrote it down in that roll, and you can see that the king did issue it to us, so you can give us another copy, right?
Yeah.
And so it's kind of also for the king to check that people aren't making things up on his behalf, or the king's officials. And so Ravenser Odd and Hull, their charters come on the same sheet in the charter rolls, and they were issued on the same day, the 1st of April, so April Fool's Day. And the reason that it's important to become a royal borough, you become exempt from loads of taxes, so it's really advantageous from that point of view. You get to manage your own affairs, so you run your own court in the town rather than being kind of subject to royal justice outside the court, although there are still things that kind of get transferred there, but you can kind of have your own prison and manage your own affairs. And then that comes with a set of responsibilities. So you have to pay a certain amount of a year to the king. But any profit you make above that, you get to keep because you're not being taxed on it. And so it's a really kind of it's a way of the king to kind of show favor to particular places, but also it's a way for the king to kind of have a sustained income. Because if you have a bad year, right, you still have to pay this king the same amount of money. So it's a kind of guaranteed income for him, but it's also a kind of show of favor. So when the town is doing really, really well, this is great for them because they're making lots of money. You get charged to bring stuff to court. They can keep all the fines. They don't have to pay a whole set of taxes across the country. But when things start going badly for the island, so when it starts sinking, it starts becoming much more of a problem because they actually can't meet their borough obligations anymore. And we have some petitions from them saying we can't pay, the island is literally sinking. We have this many fewer inhabitants than before. And they ask the king directly, like, please. And he sends some people to come to Ravenser and check that it's really sinking. Because I can see if you were the king, you might be a bit suspicious.
It's like a sinking town. What is this?
Yeah, they're like, oh. But and we have the kind of inquisition that was taken, and it was taken at Ravenser Odd, and it said, indeed, 2/3 of the said town have washed away. And kind of 2/3 of the inhabitants have left, and the remaining inhabitants they can't pay anymore, right? And so it's another kind of place where we get to see this story in these very kind of legalistic documents.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, that's incredible, really. I mean, it's really hard to fathom that a town could come out of nowhere, but more or less literally, then achieve royal borough status and then just as quickly vanish entirely. But when you consider that Hull being given the status at the same time, just shows that they must be quite comparable in status at the time, which obviously is amazing to think. I
mean, I was new at that point as well. It had just sort of grown up around it's actually moved where the River Hull used to be, so it was sort of growing up around there, and there was some monks around and kind of white sort of it starts as a little kind of settlement and then it becomes Hull. But yeah, it's all around the same time and it's all pretty new.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to come on to the mechanics of how a town vanishes later on. But in terms of what we know about how it ran, do we know anything about who was running the town, or what kind of any sort of key people whose names have emerged through the mist of what we know about Ravenser Odd?
We do have a kind of list of, a borough was run by its burgesses, so you have this kind of set of important men in the town who are kind of in charge of running it. And we see some names kind of cropping up over and over again, who they get referenced in the big court case when Grimsby takes the town to court because it says it's stealing all of its trade. They get kind of brought as witnesses in that court case. We see them again kind of in some other documents about the town. One of them's we have some accounts from the manor of the settlement, and they kind of show up there as well. Some of them, there weren't loads of medieval names, right? So almost everyone is called like John, William, John, Thomas, Henrys, a few Henrys. There's a couple of quite interesting merchants that have relationships between Hull and Ravenser. So we get there's a pair of brothers, and their surname is Rotten Herring. The Rotten Herring brothers, who are both merchants, Richard and John Rotten Herring. And unfortunately, that doesn't mean rotten herring. We think it's from the Dutch and it means red herring, right? Rot, as in red. But again, that suggests that we've got some of those kind of connections from the Netherlands, people coming, staying, deciding to settle. And then I don't know, Emily, do you want to talk a bit about the Delapoles, maybe?
Yeah, so one of the sort of myths of the place, you were saying earlier about the sort of the kind of settlement story of like somebody coming and making their riches. Like there is a story like that, which is about this guy, William Delapole, who sort of, comes from nowhere really. No one really knows who his family are. But he then founds this dynasty, which becomes again, incredibly sort of wealthy and powerful. Like at one point they're lending money to the king. They are they sort of marry into the royal line, but then they within a few generations have sort of died out on the male line. But one of the sort of potential stories about where this guy comes from is that he comes from Ravenser Odd, and that maybe he's an apprentice there, maybe he's an apprentice to the Rotten Herrings, and it's a story that sort of gets repeated through various sort of antiquarian books in the sort of early modern period, so in the sort of 16th, 17th century. But we've not been able to sort of really trace it, apart from that we do know that he was living at Ravenspurgh at some points, and we know that he then moves to Hull after it has sunk. So we don't know that he was born there. We don't know that he was necessarily this apprentice, I don't think. But it is certainly a story that kind of keeps going. And then I suppose one of the interesting things there is that this incredible amount of money that he makes, has that been made on Ravenser Odd? Is it that money that is then sort of founding the kingdom? That's a really interesting story. I think one of the sort of families that we probably want to think about is there's the sort of local earls, the kind of landowners. So there's a guy called William de Fortibus, who he's the local landowner at the time when the island emerges, and so he becomes its kind of lord. He dies. Well, in fact, there's two generations. His son dies in the 1260s, and his widow inherits. And his widow is this woman called Isabella de Fortibus, and she is very wealthy in her own right. So she also, separately from him, owns like the Isle of Wight, that she's inherited through her brother and her father. But she also then comes to own like Holderness. And she has 6 children who all predeceased her. And so then when she dies, which is in the early 1290s, I think 1291, the king then becomes the owner of Holderness, including Ravenser Odd. So even before it's a royal borough, he's also the sort of de facto landowner of it. I mean, he owns everything anyway. But there's a really interesting thing that I keep thinking about, which is that in the 19th century, this kind of court case comes up about a legal case about the ownership of the gravel on Spurn Point, and there's a aristocratic family there who are sort of in dispute with the nation, or with the crown, about whether or not they have the right to this gravel. And so their lawyers go back and they kind of trawl through all of these documents, and a lawyer is this expert in kind of antiquarian foreshore law, and he says that there's a sort of an anomaly, and that potentially these lords shouldn't have inherited this land in the first place, because if it's an island, a true island that comes in the sea rather than in the river, then it's not owned by the local landowner, it's owned by the king. It's not very clear whether that is the case, because we don't really know where Ravenser Odd is or was. That's why the question of like whether it was in the North Sea or whether it's in the Humber becomes really, really important, I think.
Oh wow! I mean, this is so good.
Yeah. And we also know about a lot of women who are connected to the island. One of the things that's kind of interesting. So one of the people mentioned in the petition I was talking about, when it kind of is sinking, the Inquisition says, when they come and look at the island, they say, you know, somebody called Cecily was a big landowner on the island, and she's lost a lot of her like land holdings on the island, like a lot of her houses have been washed into the sea. And so we have quite a lot of evidence of different medieval people, but of kind of women landowning. We'd like to know more about all of these people, but unfortunately, you know, the survival of medieval documents mean that we kind of often hear about them in a couple of places, and then they kind of, you know, we don't have their diaries or their letters or whatever. They kind of disappear from the record.
Still hoping it's going to turn up somewhere.
Yeah, imagine.
So I mean, so how prominent do we think Ravenspurgh was on a national basis? Was it on any maps or any European or British maps that we know of, or do we think it was in the mix of prominent places in England at the time?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it's, you know, like the third most important city or anything, but it's on world maps, not just UK maps. So at the time, you know, the real reason for maps is, or one of the real reasons for maps is for navigation. So you get a lot of these maps that really just kind of have the port cities around the edge, because that's what matters if you're, you know, you're sailing from Jerusalem or whatever, and you're going to arrive in England and you want to know kind of where you can land. And at first we thought we'd found it, you know, just on one or two maps. And then actually the more we look, the more it's on a lot of maps from that period, even after it has, you know, we know that it's not there anymore. It's still appearing on maps, which show that they're either sort of being copied from each other or that the sort of news hasn't caught up. But yeah, I think one of the things that we found really interesting was that it sort of replaces Grimsby. So on very early maps that we have, Grimsby is there, but Ravenser Odd and Hull don't exist yet. But then once they start to be listed, Grimsby sort of fades away, which is a bit of a shame for Grimsby.
Yeah, and the maps are made so we have a Catalan map, so from southern Spain. There's a couple of maps from Genoa, in Italy, Genova, in kind of northwestern Italy. So, and those are kind of centers of mapping, but also it kind of demonstrates how widely traveled these kind of traders are. So it does make a lot of sense, because again, by sea, it's a long way from Catalonia, because you have to go all the way around Portugal, right? And then all the way kind of through the Channel, and then all the way up the east coast. But if you're you know, if you're in the sea anyway, and often people would hug the coastline, the ships would hug the coastline, and they'd trade up and down ports, right? So they wouldn't be doing necessarily a long journey all the way from Ravenser to Barcelona, right? But they might go, you know, from Barcelona along the coast. Perhaps you'd end up somewhere in southern Portugal, you'd go up to Lisbon, you'd kind of go further out. And so you'd kind of hop along the coastline, trading as you went. And so we really see it as kind of part of this big European network of Mediterranean trade, but also in particular, of North Sea trade. So there's this kind of big triangular trade between the Netherlands, the Baltic, and Hull and Ravenser. And that also involves them kind of catching fish en route. So perhaps you'd kind of go from the Netherlands to the Baltic, catch fish on the way, trade the fish that you'd caught for wood that has been kind of brought to the ports in the Baltic, bring that wood down to Ravenser, trade that for wool that's coming from Yorkshire, right? So wool's a kind of, Yorkshire's a huge wool exporter in the period. All of those kind of monasteries like Riva and Fountains, and they're kind of big investment in the wool trade. And then you'd kind of take that wool back to the Netherlands and kind of start again, right? And we also really see the kind of trading times of year. So if you're in a relatively small boat and you're trying to cross the North Sea, you can probably only do that between about April and October. And kind of October to April, you know, stay at home in your nice warm house in the Low Countries, and you don't want to be trying to catch herring in the North Sea. And so we really see the kind of ways that it's tied up with all of these different trading networks, all the way as far down as the Mediterranean.
Fantastic. I mean, just to say, if anyone here's watching from Grimsby, you're taking a hell of a beating in
I
this
know. Yeah,
discussion.
you have
So
to remember
apologies.
they outlived it, right? You
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
Grimsby's still there, but
Exactly, yes.
when you look
Grimsby
out
and
to
Hull
sea
still
from
there. Yeah.
Grimsby, you're not seeing the kind of spires of Ravenser Odd on the horizon, right? They had the last laugh.
Indeed, yes. So this reputation for sharp practices, cutthroat activities and so forth, this pirate town reputation, is it, I mean, I assume, though I may be wrong, it's not literally a pirate town, but in what sense was it well deserved?
I guess it depends on your definition of a pirate, is what we would say. It depends what side you're on. So they are stopping ships, and we know
Yeah.
that. So there are kind of seizing ships. But if the king says that you're at war with another country and you can seize ships of that country, obviously that country's still not going to be very happy. But in theory, you're kind of covered. And so we do have a couple of quite interesting examples where Ravenser Odd are either they've acted a bit prematurely and they've seized a ship from somewhere that actually the king was not at that time at war with, and then the king writes to them as like, you have to give it back. Like you can't keep that one. But then we have some other examples of kind of there's a lot of kind of taking of wreck and wreck. So if you have a shipwreck on the shore, all of the goods from the shipwreck technically belong to the king. The king has right of wreck, which means anything that washes up. It's not just shipwrecks, it's also if a whale washes up, that's the king's. If dolphins wash up, that's the king's. Like anything that washes up on the foreshore, that is kind of technically belongs to the king. And we do have some kind of evidence that the people of Ravenser were not necessarily always following that. So we have there's quite a funny letter from the King of Norway to Edward I saying, one of my ships was shipwrecked. One of my countrymen's ships was shipwrecked with all of his goods. And he has returned like with only the clothes on his back. All his stuff is gone. Like make them give it back, basically. And so all of the goods did wash up, but somehow they have mysteriously disappeared.
Yeah.
So again, it's kind of piracy a little bit in the eye of the beholder, but also there's definitely some stuff going on that they're hoping to get away with, right? God loves a trier.
Exactly.
Also, the other thing is that they're not the only ones, right? So we do have complaints about them, but we also have them complaining about other people. So this just seems to be kind of the way things are. So Hull is doing similar things. In fact, some of the same people are doing it in both places. But also, they're complaining about, places in the Netherlands or whatever where they have also been robbed. And particularly in the early 14th century, there's a famine, and so suddenly it's a kind of more of a life or death thing. You might rob just a load of grain off a boat, and that is happening to them as well as happening because of them. So I think it is probably true, but as Cass says, it's a slightly kind of murky definitional thing, and it's not like the pirates that we think of, later in the 18th century, with these kind of swashbuckling, outlaws. It's not that at all. It's more about how trading relations can be sort of can leave themselves open to this sort of sort of intervention, I guess.
And we do see some kind of quite nasty examples. There's actually a letter from the townspeople of Ravenser Odd, so from somebody in Ravenser Odd, saying that his son went out in a ship with his crew. And that pirates and malefactors, they call them pirates and malefactors from Lubeck, boarded the ship, killed his son, and stole all of the goods on shore. It's just stole all of the goods on the boat to take back to Lubeck with them. And they want the king to gain redress on their behalf from the kind of townspeople of Lubeck. They want to have, they either want to seize one of their ships in retaliation, or they want the king to kind of get the townspeople of Lubeck to give them back. And so it's a good example of the way that this kind of thing, it becomes a bit an eye for an eye, because the king might in that point be like, oh, I can't be bothered to write to like the people of Lubeck and make them give the ship back. I'll just tell the people of Ravenser that it's fine if they take one. And then obviously what happens, right? And so you have a bit of tit for tat, but it's not like they're kind of living on the sea. They're very much kind of from it's when those trade relations get a little bit nasty, I guess.
So actually, Lubeck's a really interesting example because we do have a lot more records there. And so a colleague of ours, a guy called Philip Hone, who is German, has done a lot of research into the way that Lubeck, slightly later, but not that much later, it's kind of town records, it's guilds, it's, kind of stained glass windows in the church and stuff, are all kind of telling the story of them being strong people of the sea who can defend themselves, and like that becomes part of their own mythology. And so we don't have those kind of records, but also kind of artifacts and things from Ravenspurgh Odd. We don't know what its seal would have been or anything like this. But it's interesting to kind of put it in that spectrum to think, if that's the kind of self-image that the people of Lubeck have, then what would be the people of Ravenspurgh Odd had?
Absolutely. So what went wrong then? I mean, how what are the mechanics by which a city sinks or town sinks into the sea? I mean, how long was this process, and was this a case of rising sea levels, or what do you think happened with Ravenspurgh Odd?
Yeah, one of the things that's interesting is that it happens retrospectively quite fast, but also relatively slowly. So like we said, the town becomes a royal borough in 1299. Like, it's really riding high. This is the kind of peak of its power. And for the next kind of 15 or so years, like, everything's going well. And then what we start to see is we start seeing these repeated petitions from the townspeople that are replied to by the king, saying that they need a grant of what's called quayage, and quayage is money from boats coming in that you can use to repair your quay, so used to repair the kind of docks on Ravenser. And at one point they say, we need this because our quay has been destroyed by the violence of the sea. And so they start kind of talking about this, and we see this kind of repeatedly over time. So it's quite a common grant that the king will give. The taxes would normally go to him, but he grants them to the town instead so that they can keep trading. But we don't see it as often with any other town. They kind of keep asking for it. And so we see this moment where we're like, oh, this actually is starting to get a little bit precarious. We also see that in the manorial accounts. So Emily was saying earlier that we have this evidence of these windmills being built. And we have this moment in the manorial accounts, which is 1311, 1312, where they say, two of our windmills have been brought down by the flooding of the sea and the Humber, is kind of what they say. So we have the waters coming from both sides, and two of the three windmills on the island. So we see kind of over that preceding period, they've got one, and then they've got two, and then they've got three, and there's this moment of expansion. And then we see in this kind of big moment, two of them are kind of brought down. And then over the next 20 years, every so often, there'll be another note in the accounts that say, we still can't bring the rent in for these windmills because we still haven't rebuilt them. And so they kind of keep saying, this is, so we have these kind of little examples of how bits of the town are just being kind of washed away or taken away by, and they almost always say the flooding of the sea and the Humber, or the inundation and the flux of the sea and the Humber. And so they talk about this being kind of this place which is such an opportunity. It's a place where there's lots of wind and lots of trade, and they're the first people anyone sees coming into the Humber, but that starts being a liability, right? It starts becoming a problem. And so we're almost certain, I guess, that is the kind of, it's not one dramatic event, right? So people are kind of talked about, there's this big flood. It's 1362, isn't it, Emily? Yeah, this big flood in 1362. And the Dutch give it a very kind of evocative name, don't they? What do they call it, Emily?
It's called the Grote Mandrenke, like the Great Drowning of Men. But it's also called
Right.
the St. Marcellus flood.
Yeah, so there's this big flood in 1362 after this big storm, and people have said, "Oh, that'll be what kind of ends Ravenser." But when we've kind of looked at the material, when I've looked at the medieval records, we see that by 1359 we have this kind of we have this document. It's called an Inquisition post-mortem, and it's when somebody dies and they're a landholder for the king, they do an Inquisition post-mortem to see what kind of land they have and to pass it on to their children. And in that document is a guy called Peter Cock of Ravenser, and his daughter Cecily. And the document says that Cecily hasn't been able to inherit the land because the island has been completely annihilated by the sea by that point. So that's like the phrasing in the document, and annihilated by the sea. And so we know that kind of before this really big flood in 1362, there's already kind of nothing left.
Yeah.
And so it is this kind of slow process of coastal erosion and kind of wearing down. But it's interesting because the islanders, there are still some people living there. They actually rebuild one of the windmills in 1337, which is kind of less than 20 years before the island is completely disappeared. And so there's a real kind of sense that like maybe it's going to be all right, maybe things will kind of come back. And then they're, as far as we can tell from the documents, right, they're kind of not.
It's probably worth saying as well that although we don't think it was like this one big storm, it was a time of lots of storms. Sometimes called the Little Ice Age. So it's a time of kind of climatic change. There's a lot of bad weather. There's been this famine. It's also the time of the Black Death, incidentally. But it is a time of storms and of bad weather. So that's the kind of context, I guess, in which this is happening. And one of the sources that we have that's written retrospectively, so like 50 years later, is the Chronicle from Mute Abbey, and they talk in there. They give a very gruesome and detailed account of the fall of Ravenser Odd, including like all the bodies being washed out of the graveyard and things. But they also talk about lots of places along the east coast and along the Humber being washed away by the sea or being completely inundated by the sea. A lot of loss of livestock, loss of human life, places like Thalsthorpe. So there's, this is going on in other places as well, although as Kath says, not on quite the same sort of scale.
Wow. Yeah, and the kind of Mute Abbey Chronicle is interesting because it's not written by someone kind of on the island, and it's written like a little bit later, as Emily said, kind of 40 to 50 years later, right at the end of the 14th century, kind of 1390s. But they do tell this kind of very gruesome story about, as Emily said, the kind of bodies washing out of the sea, and they say it's judgment on them for their piracy and their wicked ways. And so this is they're kind of trying already to kind of moralize the story. So this is almost the kind of first moment where anyone calls them pirates, which is a bit unfair because they can't answer back because they're not there anymore. So they say, but this is a punishment from God, right? This is the kind of chronicle of a religious house, and they said it's a punishment from God. All of these awful things that have happened is because of their wicked ways and their piracy. And that is kind of the foundation of a lot of kind of modern stories about Ravenser Odd's piracy.
Yeah, there are some really kind of evocative phrases in there. So they talk about the bodies being washed out, but they say, until the corpses and the bones of the dead they're buried horribly appeared. So there's this really evocative phrase. But then they also, there's some more images of things like the townspeople processing around with their relics, kind of praying for mercy, and the water surrounding them like a wall. I can't quite imagine what it means by that, a huge wave, I guess. So a lot of these sort of images that we have are from this particular chronicle.
Oh wow! That's an incredible set of images there in relation to what the New Abbey Chronicles said. But I'm also kind of taken by the repeated requests to repair the quay until one day they just decide not to bother repairing the quay. It's like it's a lost cause. It's a bit like what Hemingway said about going bankrupt. It's like bit by bit, then all at once, isn't it? Really, just suddenly you don't have an island or a port to dip in anymore.
Yeah, and it's quite, I do think kind of finding all of those, like they're very poignant, like as you say, that like, oh, we can still live here, we can still make this work. And then, as you say, at one point they're just, they
Yeah.
leave. And it's interesting, so we can't trace everyone that leaves, we don't have everyone's names. Of course, there's probably at the high point of the island's life, between 600 and 1,000 people living there. There's probably quite a lot of people on the island, but we do have some names that we can kind of trace. So in the poll tax records for Hull from the 1380s, we see kind of two people with the surname Ravenser, which is kind of, again, evidence that they're kind of, so some of them have moved quite close to home. But we have somebody who's granted an inn in Calais to run by the king. And so he's obviously left Ravenser and gone to Calais. Maybe he had some of those merchant links that we were talking about, right? But we see him in the patent rolls being granted this inn to run, and he's called William Bradley of Ravenser.
Wow.
And so we can kind of trace some of these people leaving, although obviously not all of them.
Is it the Bishop of Lincoln, the Archbishop of Lincoln? I can't remember. Somebody who goes on to become an important religious figure in Lincoln is also a Ravenser.
Yeah, Richard of Ravenser.
And there's a tomb in Hull Minster that it shows, we think, his brother-in-law, who was mayor of Hull, and sister. It's not completely clear, but that's the sort of attribution that is accepted at the minute.
Yeah, so we see these people kind of scattering, right?
Yeah. I mean, I was quite taken. If we come back to an earlier part of our conversation about the Royal Borough seal, in that obviously Hull managed to keep theirs, and of course no one appears to have fought Ravenser Odd Burgundy Valley, because obviously no one appears to have rescued the seal or taken it anywhere or thought, we'll keep this. They appear to be probably quite surprised.
I mean, get lost later, maybe things were taken to Hull, but then, later on there were the poll tax riots within the same century, and a lot of documents were destroyed then, or, it isn't necessarily that it's sunk with the island. It just hasn't survived till now, or isn't traceable. Things still get found in attics all the time, don't they? So
yeah, have a look if you're anywhere nearby, anywhere near the Humber. Go on, have a look in your attic.
Every now and then I sort of trawl some American kind of sales auction sites, for like random medieval charters and stuff, because you never know, stuff gets
I think that's a brand new quest to go.
Yeah, absolutely.
The Ravenser seal, Ravenser Odd seal. Okay, well, so we're just coming towards the end of our conversation now, unfortunately, because it's absolutely fascinating stuff. So how can our audience and supporters find out more about the project going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. So that we've got some kind of material on the National Archives website. There's also Emily has a website about the project, which I'm sure we can share. And if people are interested, so there's a local historian called Phil Matheson who is in Hull, who has written a kind of very interesting book about Ravenser Odd. It's one of the kind of early books we read about it. And we'd kind of recommend that if people want to find out more. He's got a really useful list of everyone that we know to have lived on the island, which is great if people really want that kind of nitty-gritty detail. Emily, is there anything else you'd kind of point to?
Comic. So
yes.
So we commissioned a comic book artist, Gareth Slateholm, who is based in Hull and has done loads of kind of historical comics as a project with the Hull Maritime Museum. And he did one about Ravenser Odd, which includes some of the research that we did and a lot of his own sort of research that he's been working on for years as well. So that's available free to download. I'll send you the link for.
Yeah, and also if you're anywhere near Scunthorpe, our kind of travelling exhibition is travelling to Scunthorpe quite soon to some local libraries and museums there. So we can send some details through about that. But there's we've had this kind of small exhibition travelling around the Humber to kind of places nearby where Ravenser Odd would have been. So it's been to Cleethorpes, it's been to the Spurn Point Discovery Centre, it was in Withensea, and it's going to be in Scunthorpe. It's been in Grimsby, in kind of 2 sites in Grimsby.
Yeah.
It was in the Minster, and now it's going to be in Scunthorpe Libraries. But also, feel free to get in touch with us if if you have any, if you find those documents in your attic, let us know. Always fun.
Well, I definitely, I heartily recommend the comic book. I printed that off a long time ago, but it's absolutely brilliant. So
it's great.
I recommend it. Of course, if you're in Scunthorpe, then by all means go to the Drama exhibition. If you're from Grimsby, apologies, you took quite a lot of insults in that presentation, but there was just the time. It was the era of Ravenser Odd. Grimsby's time would come. Subsequently. So thank you so much to Emily and Kathryn for that amazing talk, and it's really interesting stuff. And I'm even more interested in the sunken cities of the East Coast and the Humber than I was before, and that's saying something to why we're here in the first place. So massive thank you both. I'm looking forward to keeping up to date with this project. Thank you all for watching, and stay tuned for the next act, and don't forget to donate to our fundraiser for the RNLI, especially if that tail of the body is floating in the sea after the collapse of Ravenser Odd didn't bring home the importance of the RNLI, then nothing will.
Oh,
So thank you very much.
Thanks, Joel.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.